welcome. So 5 minutes for each of you to react live to what you've just heard, and then we'll take some more questions from Slido. Who'd like to kick off? Liana, I'll hand over to you.
Sure. Tēnā tātou. A lot has been shared this morning, and I think certainly my view as a local iwi hapu perspective, we don't need convincing about the reasons why we should transition to a low emissions economy. And I guess I've heard a number of people say that participation is key. Participation of the communities and every sector of that community, and from my perspective, specifically iwi and hapu. I guess we are, here in Taranaki, we've been through a number of transitions. For iwi and hapu, we've transitioned through settlement, we've transitioned through colonisation, we've transitioned through land loss, we've transitioned, in recent times through the closure of freezing works, the closure of local dairy companies in rural areas, and now we're facing another transition. So for us here in Taranaki, and I'm speaking with my iwi pōtai on, my iwi hat on, we are no strangers to transitioning. But our experience has shown us that we haven't necessarily participated in those transitions, which has meant that we've been those of the community that are most negatively impacted. And I think that the key going forward into this new transition phase, our people, my people, have the potential to be the most negatively impacted, because there continues to be an unacceptable level of deprivation within my communities. And so a transition process for us moving to low emissions economy, we have now an opportunity to upskill our people to be able to fill roles in the new economy. And for me, with my iwi pōtai on, it's really important that we not only provide for the development or the re-education or reinvestment in alternative energies for those of our companies that are already involved in energy and moving them to a new work stream, but it's also about upskilling those that aren't currently participating in the energy sector, and allowing them and enabling them to move into whatever the future holds. One of the things that I'm interested to understand in the transition process is also remembering to plan for the legacy of what's left behind. And often as iwi and hapu, we are the communities that are left, in my view anyway, to pick up the pieces. And what happens in a transition process is we're planning for growth, we're planning for alternatives, we're planning for new investment, but sometimes we forget to plan for what happens with the things that we're transitioning out of. So for example, what happens with structures? We've talked about ending offshore drilling and permitting, but what happens to those structures once we get to 2050? What happens to the structures that are onshore? And understanding what happens to the communities that actually have to live with the legacy of what we're transitioning out of. So for me, a key focus is also looking at making sure that we plan for what we're leaving behind as well as what we are heading to, I guess. When I talk about legacy, I guess for us as iwi and hapu, we're really clear we're not going anywhere. And I think Wharehoka said that earlier on. And let's be clear about iwi entities and iwi. Iwi entities are not iwi per se. They are representative of our iwi. So our iwi entities might be wealthy, they might not be wealthy, but actually the people on the ground are our iwi. And so our previous panel, when they said make people the centre of any transition planning, I absolutely agree with that, because our iwi entities are nothing without our people. And so I really want to support that aspect and that focus of a transition. I guess here in Taranaki, we want to be involved, and I guess what I'm saying is that we are committed to be involved and participating at the very beginning. So from let's co-design, let's co-plan, so that everybody's involved right from the beginning, rather than our experience, which is coming in at the back end of a planning process. So really getting stuck in the very early stages of planning. And, you know, it will take courage, in my view. And I think we have to do more, and we have to challenge ourselves to do more. It will take courage, and I say that because I'm a granddaughter of a former coal miner who was unfortunately killed in a state coal mine. I'm also the granddaughter of a 2-time winner of Māori Farmer of the Year in the dairy section. And so it will take courage for all of us to change our behaviours. And I think one of the things that I do want to end on is around education, where the last panel ended on. We have to engage in serious conversations and education around our consumer behaviours too, because we're looking at all of these alternative methods for energy. Actually, do we need to be consuming as much energy as we currently are? And what are we doing to reduce how we're consuming and what our consumer behaviour is? So it will take courage, whānau, but I think we're all up for that challenge. Kia ora.
Which is why it's so important that the conversation can't just stay in this room, right? Mm-hmm. It's not just about industry leaders, it's about ordinary mums and dads, Kiwis in all parts of the country. And even though this concept of a just transition to some will be quite complex and controversial, it's about that literacy, which also starts through education. So thank you, Liana. Sam, your 5 minutes.
Kia ora koutou katoa. Tuatahi mihi ki ngā mana whenua o tēnei rohi, ngā iwi me ngā hapu, tēnā koutou mua koutou manaakitanga kia mātou, I oro tō whenua, I oro tō rohi, mō tēnei hui I tēnei wā, tēnā tātou katoa. Look, I just wanted to give my greetings and give, I guess, a window on what for the Council of Trade Unions a just transition looks like. And in a way it's a relatively simple premise, which is that the costs which are necessary in order for us to meet the urgent change we need to do in order to reduce the impact of climate change, those costs can't be disproportionately shared or falling on those who can least afford it, which include Māori, which include working people, which include poor people. And so if we take that as our foundation and work from there, then a lot of the policies make sense and can flow from that sort of really important principle. So for workers, there's 2 really key aspects for a just transition. The first is economic diversification, and that is well underway already with the combined weight of the Provincial Growth Fund and the Green Investment Bank, and I want to acknowledge the Prime Minister and Minister Wood's announcement this morning on that, which will make a fantastic contribution to getting that going in terms of clean energy. I'd also make a plug for community economic development, particularly in a region like Taranaki, where there's a very proud history of community economic development, in part supported by the former Community Employment Group. There's a strain of work there we need to pick up on as well. So economic diversification is really important, but alongside that, a dedicated plan to support workers through change is absolutely critical. And in policy speak, we call that active labour market policies. And sort of unpicking the term, it's an active labour market policy, or an active approach to workforce and to the labour market, is the opposite of a passive approach. And that's what we want to avoid when we talk about a just transition, that the model for workers and jobs which are finishing, the model isn't just rock up to MSD and WINS and put your name on a job board. Actually, we're mapping out the skills and expertise and talents of a workforce as a whole, and having a dedicated plan to map that over to new emerging industries with all the support systems in place we need, include income smoothing if it's needed, including retraining while you're still on the tools. You know, a miner I spoke to last year, I said, what's the most important thing for you in a just transition? And it was the ability to retrain and learn the new skills that they needed to get the new licenses, qualifications, while they're still on the job, without having to take that massive income drop to study to then go back into the new job. So getting that workplace learning right is really critical for that. Just a couple of examples I wanted to give you in terms of some practical recent history on good examples of transition work that's happened in locally New Zealand, both for very difficult circumstances and ones we didn't support. But for the textile and clothing and textile industry in Christchurch, about 10 years ago, suffered a major economic shock with the closure of several big employers. Lane Walker Runkin went into receivership, Pacific Brands closed after the earthquake. And in both those instances, the union for those workers, First Union, negotiated to set up a redundancy support coordinator in those jobs. And that person was the head site union delegate, so well known, well trusted to that workforce. And it was their job to work with the local Canterbury Employers Chamber of Commerce, the manufacturers, all the employers with work and income, of course, to have a plan in place to support all the workers on those sites into new jobs. And that it worked terribly successfully, so it was a really good approach. Likewise, the work that Aotearoa Union did with members at Cadbury's in Dunedin recently when Mondelez made the decision to close that site. They, working with the industry training organisation, went through all of the workers on the job and mapped out their existing skills using recognition of prior learning, so they could leave that job with the confidence of the qualifications and the ticket to represent what their skills were in food manufacturing to take on to new jobs, many of whom had been there for a good couple of decades and hadn't had that formal qualifications. So dedicated plans to support workers through that change is really critical for us. And I guess finally, we need to have a really frank conversation, as Sam touched on how we fund the transition. And I guess I was dismayed with the response to some of the proposals, the good proposals that the tax working group have put up. And we need to, that's on all of us as a society, not just our government, it's on all of us actually to come up with a frank analysis and assessment about how we support and fund this transition. Because we've all got things we need. Workers need support with training. Industry is looking for support from government in terms of diversification. A lot of this stuff costs money. And so unless we've got a dedicated plan to support our governing parties with the resources they need to distribute that resource to help us diversify, that funding is a really key part of the mix for us. We'll leave it there for now.
Thanks, Sam. Kevin.
Ko te mea tuatahi ka tautoko ngā mihi mō ngā mana whenua o tēnei rohi, tēnā koutou. Ka mihi hoki ki te tupuna maunga, no reira tēnā koe te rangatira taranaki maunga. I ngā mana, i ngā reo, i ngā iwi o te motu, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Great to be here. I want to emphasize, I guess, speed. What we do in the next 2 to 3 years will determine our future. This is the defining moment. I'll come back to that. So I've been, I guess, studying climate change since the 1970s. So I have a degree in atmospheric and marine physics and have been increasingly involved in all of the years since that time. I speak today with a couple of capacities. One is as the Chief Executive of Forest and Bird, and just earlier this week we saw the announcement from the UN conference about the massive extinction event that we are currently living through. And both that and the climate change crisis that we're discussing today come from the same mindset, the mindset that sees the environment and people as inputs into the economy. And we need to reverse that. We need to ensure that our social and our environmental goals drive our use of economic tools. That's the way around it needs to be. I also come from a perspective as a person who lives on the West Coast. I mean, the real West Coast. So, and I've spent, I guess, the last 15 years on and off in conversation with coal miners and coal mining communities and have some perspectives on that, which I want to share. On time frame, transition is going to happen anyway. So the choice that we have is whether we manage that transition and take maximum advantage of the opportunities that present itself, minimize the adverse effects, or whether we simply allow our status quo system to crash. That's the only choice. If we're going to manage it, the time is very short. I said earlier, what we do in the next 2 to 3 years will determine our future, and this is the defining moment. Those actually aren't my words. Those are the words that Rajendra Pachauri said. He was the chair of the IPCC, and he said those words in 2007. So I'm not so interested in talking about conversations and discussions starting. I'm interested in talking about action. And there are two main reasons that we need to make the transition that we make a just one. One of them is simply the principled one that Sam has just been talking about, that actually if we want people to make change in the public interest, it's only reasonable that the public actually pays for and facilitates that transition. So that's the principle. The pragmatic one is that if we want to make change fast, then doing so in a just way minimises the disruption of objection and delay. So, some lessons from coal miners. First of all, they need a specific plan. What job is it actually that I'm going to do? Because just waving your hands and saying, tourism, clean energy is not enough. As Sam from the earlier panel said, they've got to be good jobs too. We need to work both at individual and community levels. They're both important. We might need to change the extractive mindset as well. So if we're fostering a tourism sector, it's got to be not, okay, how can we get the maximum volume? It's got to be about quality and depth of the new industries. And I just want to make one comment about my West Coast experience, just in closing. On the West Coast, transition away from coal mining has largely occurred. But if you ask the average West Coaster what the main industry on the West Coast was, they would still say coal mining, because it's so fundamental to our identity and our culture. In fact, coal mining is a long way down the list. We have already made that transition, but we haven't made the transition in people's minds. And the result of that is that the transition we've made has not realised all of the gains that it could have done. And I urge Taranaki, and I urge the wider New Zealand community to not make that same mistake.
Thanks, Kevin. Robert.
Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Taranaki manga, Taranaki tangata, tēnā koutou katoa. Ko Robert Spurway aho, no Fonterra aho. First I want to say it is an honour to be here with so many leaders, respected leaders, in the people, leaders of the people that are going to be required for this just transition. In particular, I want to acknowledge the Prime Minister and the government's leadership of this issue. As my fellow speakers have said, it is going to take courage, and it is a lot about people. We've seen in this conference many different views presented, and I think one of the great things about that is those views create discussion, they create diversity of views, and that ultimately will lead to better solutions as we move through this just transition. I think what we can say though, despite the diversity of those views, is everyone, and certainly from a Fonterra perspective, we share the same goals and the same ambitions for New Zealand. It's fair to say that representing the dairy sector and talking about what we do at Fonterra, we do have a lot of skin in the game. Not only the investment that our cooperative but our farmers have made over many years, but also the number of people that we employ. The dairy sector employs about 47 or 48,000 people, so this is all about people. And the great thing about that is most of those jobs, nearly all of them, are in regional New Zealand. If I look at what that means for us, every day we have 10,000 farmers holding us to account on how we make the most of their milk. That's not just what we earn for them, it's not the money we bring back to the New Zealand economy, but it's also doing that in a sustainable way. And it's not only our farmers that hold us to account on that, it's also increasingly communities and our customers around the world. I guess it's not only farmers that we're answerable to, we're very clear it's all of New Zealand that we're answerable to. I mentioned before 47 or 48,000 people employed in the sector. 10,000 of those are in our operations team within Fonterra, people that I'm responsible for every day. Those people get up every day, they pick up driving tankers, milk from a farm about every 9 seconds. Those tankers deliver milk to a factory about every 24 seconds. And importantly, we close the doors on an export container about every 3 minutes. So that's what's involved in bringing back something like $10 or $12 billion to regional New Zealand every year. In doing that, we are a significant energy user. We acknowledge that. We use a lot of electricity, we use a lot of coal, and we use a lot of gas. And we take that responsibility very seriously. I guess I'd say, though, that scale not only gives us an obligation to make a difference, but it gives us an opportunity to really make a difference and help lead and help the rest of New Zealand get there on our way to carbon neutral by 2050. I want to talk for a moment about some of the things that we've done addressing what is a significant problem and what's a problem that won't be solved by one single solution. We've worked with others, we've worked with the government. Last year with MFE, we completed a roadmap for a renewable future. And roadmaps are important because they not only set the targets, but they also work out how we're going to get there and what needs to be done. As I said, that's across a whole range of things that we're looking at. We also have worked with our farmers and with communities. One of the programs that we're rolling out we call Cooperative Difference. That's not just about helping farmers do better and accelerating the improvements they're already making, but it's about giving them the tools and the information that they need to do better, and it's also about recognising the progress they're making. And I think recognising progress and celebrating along the way to a just transition is going to be critical. Back into our operations. Over the last 12 to 18 months, we've committed to electrify our Stirling site. We've converted our Brightwater site from coal to a mix of coal and biomass. That's saving 25% of emissions. Just last month, we completed a trial at Atiawa, allowing us to move to wood chips. That'll take the equivalent of about 18,500 cars off the road. We'd also like to say that we know we're not alone. I mentioned before we feel an obligation, we feel an opportunity to lead, but we're working with others, whether it's MFE and the government or communities. It's also other businesses. ECA have supported us. We've also worked with Z Energy to be a foundation customer for biodiesel in our tanker fleet. So I guess, summing up, it is about people. Transitions always are. We're proud of the fact that our industry is one of the most emissions efficient in the world. We also recognise that we need to do more. We are doing more, and we're up for that. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa.
Kia ora.
Thanks, Robert. Okay, so we've got about 50, we're a little bit over in terms of time, but we are going to take the next 10 to 15 minutes to finish this session with your questions. And to do that, I'm going to take the liberty to merge some of them and to go off this script, and we will just have a conversation, because I think there are some issues that are starting to emerge as themes through those questions, and it's more important that we address the themes rather than addressing individual questions word for word. So Liana, one of the main themes that's come forward, and I touched on this in the last session, what does it mean for Māori and for iwi to genuinely be at the table in these conversations?
How long have we got? It just means a genuine engagement from the beginning.
What does that look like?
Well, it's having us at the table from the very start. It's acknowledging that while we might have different views, it doesn't mean we walk away from the table. We can still stay at the table and nut things out. It means that we co-design it. So we're not the decision's made here and then we're engaged on what it is over here. It's that we're jointly developing what the decision, and making the decision, and jointly developing the plan, I guess.
Sorry to interrupt, what
Yeah.
is your sense at the moment, and this is a very generalised question, and you can answer it however you like, where are we at with that? How do Māori feel? Again, incredibly generalised, but how do Māori feel about whether they are at the table or not?
It's pretty tough to
nationally?
speak on behalf of all Māori,
Yeah,
too,
of
but
Of course, but because I think that is important. We can't actually move forward constructively unless we have a gauge as to how well we're doing on that front.
sure. I think the general feeling that we have is that we're not being engaged
Right.
genuinely, and that's because a lot of things are decided or planned for us and then brought to us for feedback or comment. And so that has to change, and that's been our experience in transitions to date. So
Yes.
for example, if I look at the freezing work closures, they happened in Waitara and Pātea.
Yeah.
I mean, all over, but Waitara and Pātea specifically were Māori communities. And engagement with Māori communities may not have made the impacts on those communities felt as strong as they were, and the negative impacts of those. Had we been at the table, we may have been able to foresee some of that and plan for it. And so it's easy to look in hindsight, but definitely going forward, we need to be at the table early. We're treaty partners. Full stop. We're treaty partners. We represent those that signed the treaty. We have to be there. Wharehoka said, we add value. Totally believe that we add value. And actually, if we look at demographics, 70% of the Māori population are under 40. So if Māori are underperforming in 2050, then our entire country is underperforming.
So the risk here is that if we can sit and have this conversation, but unless we bring Māori along for the ride and other groups that are marginalised in this conversation, we're not actually going to achieve the outcomes that we say we're going to achieve by 2050.
No, and there won't be buy-in, quite frankly, and it works across the community and sectors. If you haven't got buy-in from your community and each sector within that community, then we're setting ourselves up to fail.
So in a more general sense then, Sam, how do we communicate this to people who are not sitting and reading policy documents or coming to events like this, people who are actually just trying to earn a crust and provide for their families? How do we actually communicate this to them and give them a sense of hope that there is employment opportunities for them, good opportunities for
You
their kids?
touched on hope, and I think that's the key thing for me, is that in climate policy there's a lot of fear, and rightly so, because I'm utterly afraid about how, as Kevin's mentioned, how long we've got left to properly deal with this, and New Zealand's one of many, right? But one of the things which we can do is to give people hope that by acting collectively on some of these issues, you've got a better chance than by acting alone. And that's what unions are all about. We know that if you act on your own with your employer, you'll get one outcome. If you pull your resources together and come together in a collective organisation, a union, hapu, whatever it is, then your ability to put forward your collective views is a lot stronger. And I think for climate, where people think, oh, but I'm doing the plastic bags and I'm trying to do this and this, that individual stuff is at the margins. What's needed is the collective response. And so for a workforce, having a really strong sense that there's a plan in place for the whole workforce affected, that gives people hope that they can be part of it and take some of the fear away.
And how much...
Could I add
Yeah,
something
sure,
to
go.
that, Jenna? I think that one of the crucial factors is actually ensuring that we're not sending mixed messages to people. Because I think one of the reasons, if we reflect on why it's taken so long and almost nothing's happened, one of the reasons is that we've continued to send, at all levels in fact, mixed messages. We've said this is really important, but because we haven't been doing anything, people have been thinking, oh, well, is it really important or isn't it? Because if it really was, then government would have been doing more about it. So I think stopping sending those mixed messages is really important. And I think also providing a clear path forward. So providing the hope and the opportunity in what's available. Ideally, not getting into a situation where people are hedging their bets. Because it's kind of human nature, I don't know, 80% of people, if you gave them a choice between, well, you could keep doing this thing that you're doing now, that you're familiar with and feels comfortable and is secure. Or you could do this new thing that might well be more exciting. Okay, people will choose the status quo. Most people will. So if we do have an example here in Taranaki with the onshore permits. We're kind of giving a mixed message about what the future will be.
You talked earlier, and Sam, you touched on this around specificity and what we're actually providing people with, because we're saying we want you to move away from this. What are you actually, if I'm sitting at home trying to work out what this job or industry is actually going to look like, what my 9 to 5 is going to look like, how do we communicate that to your coal miners and people in industries that are more traditional?
So what I did, and on the West Coast there's been a series of forums at Blackball involving environmentalists and coal miners and sometimes politicians, sometimes they're front up. And what I tried to do was actually move beyond this. Tourism's going to be great. You could get jobs in the green energy sector, and instead started to say, okay, here are industries that we currently have now. Here is how that industry could deliver higher value jobs that paid more wages, and try to provide some specifics around that. And I think that's what we need to do for these people. In fact, on the West Coast, the number of people involved is so small that actually government could just underwrite their wages for the rest of their lives.
Isn't part of the problem...
I'm not suggesting that as a general principle.
Isn't part of the problem, Robert, around the story that we've been telling for a long time? We have a very entrenched, very comfortable mythology, I guess, as a country about who we are and what we do and our relationship with the land. And that's something we're really proud of and is a huge part of who we are. There's a question here around, could Fonterra become a plant-based milk and milk product company? To what extent do we need to evolve the story, change the story, and recognise that actually there are other chapters that may come that may look different to the story we've been telling for the last few decades?
Yeah, I think that's something that New Zealand is famous for, and the farming sector and dairy farming sector in particular. We all know what number 8 wire is. We have the mentality that New Zealanders can do anything with number 8 wire. I think we're a little more sophisticated these days, but what we see is our farmers already innovating, improving their productivity, looking at new ways to do things, rising to those challenges. And this is just a new and big challenge. And we have the opportunity not just to make a difference for New Zealand, but to lead the world. Because the reality of this sort of transition is what we do in New Zealand is kind of interesting, but it only really makes a difference when the rest of the world pick it up. And I think I touched on the fact before that we're already one of the most efficient agriculture nations in the world. So if we can turn that into being really efficient and really sustainable, we can help the rest of the world in that space.
So what is Fonterra's plan on this? That question there, what is Fonterra actively doing to transition from dairy? Is that what you are doing?
Look, I wouldn't say that we're actively looking to transition from dairy. Our focus is on helping our farmers respond to this challenge and lead this challenge. We are working, and we've made a small investment in research around plant-based and alternative proteins.
So that's something you're looking at?
That is something that we're doing now, not just looking, doing now. We make a range of products that have plant-based components. So I think the question's a very good question and a very fair question. And the important word in there is this is not an or, it's an and. So how can milk be complemented by plant? And that's something that we're looking at and working with right now with our farmers.
And if what the Camerons are saying, for example, is true, if these trends play out, are you expecting to see the scales tip as consumer demand changes in future decades?
Look, you need to look at the world. We are an exporting nation in New Zealand. We're a very efficient exporter of food. And at its heart, food is energy. We're exporting energy to the world. So there's a conversation in the developed world and the wealthy economies, but there's also a huge and growing need for protein in the emerging economies. We trade with over 140 countries, and what we see is huge growth in consumption, outstripping supply to feed a growing population around the world. So I think the challenge here is not producing less, it's actually producing more, but doing it in a more efficient, more sustainable way, because that's what the world needs to feed a growing population.
This question from Neil around the demand side behaviour and educating consumers. We've talked a little bit about education. I mean, the plastic bag ban was an interesting one, wasn't it? Because we also had a lot of media coverage last year around things like single-use straws. Now, for those who are actually up to speed with this, we know what a minute contribution single-use straws actually play in the greater scheme of plastic waste. So, how do we actually bring consumers along? Because I don't think anyone reasonably would expect Fonterra to make massive changes that are also going to have really poor implications for your business. I mean, you're responding to the needs of consumers. So how do we then try and pull consumers in the direction that we want to go to from a policy perspective, any of you?
Certainly, I think we talked earlier, or one of the panels talked earlier about fear.
Yeah.
And not that this is my parenting style, but, fear actually drives action sometimes. And if we have the facts in front of us and we are faced with, it's that whole stay or run kind of mentality, stay and fight or run. And if we're faced with that, part of it is we have to confront what the actual facts are and confront that we are in a crisis and that we have to do something now. Yes, planning's good, but what are the little steps that we have to achieve in that 2050 plan to take action? And fear, in my view, is a good thing because you either fight and you come out fighting, which I know a lot of our people do, when they're faced with fear or in a crisis situation, they come out fighting. And perhaps that's one thing we actually have to confront is our fear.
Kevin, the fear hasn't worked though, has it? Because your point earlier, the fact that we've been having a lot of very similar conversations for a number of decades, you've been in politics, you know what that's looked like in the media and in the legislative side. What do we need to think more strategically about how we have this conversation?
Well, absolutely strategy is a critical, almost entirely missing component of our response to climate change currently. We've got a great problem definition, we're throwing tactics at it, but there's some missing bits in the middle. I want to say, you used the word nudge, and I think unfortunately that for sort of many of our leaders, they're still in the space of trying to nudge solutions. We're long past the point where that could possibly work. We actually do have some examples of the world taking the kind of action that's necessary in terms of scale and urgency. Look at the way that the world geared up for the Second World War, for example. Well, governments didn't, nudge people to perhaps change their production in their factories away from what they were doing to something else. They didn't nudge people to change the way that they were feeding their families. They actually gave leadership strong rules and sort of very clear consequences for non-action. I think we have to go there.
Okay, so we're talking about compelling people?
Yep.
And Sam, how do we do that in a way that actually brings perhaps the most marginalised people on the outskirts who are already struggling to make things work? How do we actually bring them along without creating even more misery for them?
Giving a really strong sense that when we're making decisions to adapt to and mitigate the impact of climate change, that we're making conscious thoughts around mitigating some of those distributional impacts on it. So when we have policies which hit the poor with regressive taxes, with penalties and others, with subsidies for EVs without any thought through to people for whom a $1,500 combustion engine car is the only thing that's going to go in for their whānau, we need a really strong sense from policymakers that we will take that into account, that we will leave no one behind as we bring in these climate policies, and that it won't just be left to chance, that we won't just leave it to the market to make up those decisions to support poor people and consumers.
And Robert, how do we bring industry along?
I think it's about bringing everyone. What we're seeing is the government's had the courage to set ambitious targets for the country. I think the rest of the world will look to that and what we do in New Zealand. All of us have spoken about the importance of not just customers and consumers, but in a Fonterra context, the work we're doing with New Zealand communities through our farmers, the work we're doing with our unions, ETU and the Dairy Workers Union in particular, but also the work with government through partnerships with MFE. And I think that applies to everyone. If you bring all of your stakeholders with you in the light of strong and ambitious targets, we'll achieve more than we ever thought was possible.
There are two interesting words we have to wrap up. There's two interesting words that came out of that last 20 minutes, which is fear and hope. And I guess everyone in this room would sit at a different end of the spectrum and have a different view on how we use those, whether we use them exclusively, whether we use them together. Liana, just to wrap up, what are your thoughts on, is it fear or is it hope that actually will push people towards a just transition?
I think, I mean, we're always hopeful as iwi and hapu, but I think fear drives us a lot. We're a lot more passionate about getting out of fearful situations and difficult situations than we respond to hope, because that hasn't been our experience. And I guess, we talk about the offshore announcement, but actually, anecdotal information has us at about 10 years of reserves. An announcement to not issue new permits onshore, that pushes us into a place where we have to take action now. Because at the moment we've got no to offshore, we've got, onshore, that's still happening. We had a recent block offer, and I guess, it's part of that mixed messages that Kevin was talking about. We've got one announcement, but actually that just puts pressure on shore for more, more people tendering. And so we really have to push ourselves into, I think, nothing like a good deadline to push us to achieving something, and that would be my view.